I can't remember the exact moment. Maybe it was the first time I heard a story that just felt like it was speaking directly to me. No flashy visuals or distractions, just someone's voice, raw and real. Or maybe it was when I realized that with just a mic, an idea, a little courage, anyone could step up and take the conversation in any direction, and no one sees it coming. The right words, the right pauses, the right moment can make someone stop in their tracks. I fell in love with the way voices carry more than words alone. They carry energy, intention, connection. The way a well-placed silence could say just as much, if not more, than the loudest voice. I fell in love with the intimacy of it, the trust it builds, the fact that someone somewhere chooses to press play, to invite you into their space, to run with you, to drive with you, to sit with you in their quietest moments, sometimes their hardest moments. And that's when I knew this wasn't just a format or another marketing channel. It wasn't just content. It was never just a podcast. That's when I fell in love with podcasting. So every year on Valentine's Day, we're going to share what we've learned over the past year, helping you stay confident in your ability to create shows that you love. Because podcasting isn't just another content play, it's a strategy, it's story, it's connection, it's the heartbeat of your brand. I'm Rachel Elsts Downey, founder of Share Your Genius, and this is, wait for it, it's an annual love letter to podcasting. I think one of the best lines that kicks off a story is that the best way to start is to start from the beginning. And so that's what we're going to do. And I have two beginnings to share with you before we dive into the world of podcasting as we know it in 2025. We're going to go back in time a little bit. So our first story, it's how I actually fell in love with it. Really became personal in 2016. I was spending my life at the hospital. Literally, I could not leave. I had gone into preterm labor with my first daughter, Lennon, at 24 weeks, and I was on bed rest at the hospital, monitored 24/7, IVs in arms, hooked up to all the things. And I had intense anxiety. There's only so much HGTV that you can stare at before you actually lose your mind. And so I started listening to podcasts as a way to close my eyes and imagine a positive outcome for the situation that I was in. It kept me feeling connected to something other than the hospital routine that I was living in. And after the arrival of my daughter, Lennon, who was born at just a few weeks later, 26 weeks, I found myself at another crossroads, juggling life of a new mom living in the NICU while trying to figure out how to create some type of income for my family, all while figuring out what my new life was going to look like, not knowing the outcome of hers. Serendipitously, around that same time, a friend of mine asked for my help. He asked me to help him launch his new podcast. It was an opportunity for me to work any hours that I wanted or needed. I could dig into this world that I had suddenly been way more intentionally exposed to, and I could do it in a way that was meaningful, pulling in my background as a content marketer and allowing me to stay fully present for my family and my daughter during that time. And very, very quickly, I realized something incredible. Podcasts were both content and a channel, and he was using it to fuel his new business, and it was working. He was generating deals. He was having conversations that opened doors for him. He was creating content to fuel his marketing channels, and the show became the foundation for the brand he was building. As I was thinking about what life was going to look like for me and my family and my daughter, I had this just underwhelming feeling of why aren't more brands using podcasts? I had just spent over a decade working in a content marketing agency, working with all types of companies and brands, and they were trying to get their message to market, and they were trying to do it in a way that was sustainable, that was interesting, that was entertaining, that was impactful, that was affordable. And I just kept sitting there going, this podcast is doing all of those things and more. And so now here I am. I'm paraphrasing and synthesizing and speeding up a very long journey and jumping through timelines. But ultimately, that is where Share Your Genius was born. It was born in the hospital alongside my daughter. So that was the beginning. And since then, we have launched thousands of shows, produced thousands of episodes that have generated millions in downloads. And we've done it all with one mission in mind, a mission that came to my mind in a hospital room: to foster human connection. And while that's our altruistic mission, our vision is steadfast. We work with brands to help them turn their podcasts into outcomes. Now you've got your history lesson. We're going to get to the heart of it for the rest of our show because it's going to be broken into two parts. We'll go through the highlights of the industry in the last year, 2024, and then I'm going to share how you can take and use that information and apply it to your own marketing strategy. Whether you have a show or you don't have a show, this show is going to be useful for you and how you think about podcasting for your marketing strategy. So let's start with last year's highlights. I can summarize them in 3 stats and 3 overarching trends. Hopefully in 2026, we'll revisit these stats to see how the industry continues to evolve in our next love letter. So stat number 1, how many podcasts are there? So today, Spotify claims that there are over 6 million registered podcasts to its app, and industry estimates suggest we're just shy of 10 million overall. That may seem like a lot, but compare it to 600 million blogs, and suddenly podcasting feels and still is the blue ocean that it was when we launched this company back in 2016. And for some added context, when Share Your Genius started, there were just under 2 million podcasts globally. So again, at that rate, in the comparison to the blog content out there, we are still in the early days. So when people ask the question of, isn't the channel, the medium already saturated? You can confidently tell them, hell no. So is that growth sustainable? Let's go into stat number 2. Podcast consumption in the U.S. is at an all-time high, and it is growing. 98 million Americans tune in weekly, and 135 million Americans listen monthly. That's 47% of the U.S. population over 12 years old. Just to put that into perspective, last year, there were 120 million monthly podcast listeners. That's growth by 15 million. And the average American listens to about 8.3 episodes per week, which is up from around 7 episodes a week just a few years ago. So what's the takeaway? There's an opportunity for brands to grab audience attention because the appetite for content in this format, it is still growing. The key is being present and consistent, tailoring content to listener behavior, i.e. commute-friendly formats, binge-worthy episodes, and creative storytelling. So let's move into our stat number 3. YouTube. YouTube is now the most used podcast platform, but that doesn't necessarily mean what you think it means. So while YouTube leads the charge with 31% of weekly podcast consumers, Spotify follows at 21%, and Apple Podcasts has dropped to 12%. Some context for you, when I started in this business, Apple Podcasts dominated with 93% of market share. That is clearly no longer the case. YouTube and Spotify are pushing this industry forward. They're investing in analytics, interactivity, and creator tools. They're making it easier to create. They're creating monetization efforts that generate real income for creators. And they're looking at ways to help you engage directly with your audience. But let's pause on that for just a second, because here's what most people aren't talking about when it comes to YouTube's quote unquote podcast dominance. Let's talk about what the data actually is telling us. Yes, YouTube is the #1 podcast platform, but that doesn't mean podcasting has become a video-first medium. Matter of fact, 69% of podcast consumption, it's happening on audio-first platforms. That's Spotify, that's Apple Podcast, and the other apps. Most YouTube podcast listeners aren't actually or actively watching their screen. In fact, 2/3 of them are minimizing the screen or listening without watching the video. And business podcast audience, they favor YouTube, but not necessarily for B2B. Data from the Business Podcast Consumer Study suggests that YouTube is strong in entrepreneurship, personal finance, and hustle culture. Because when you zoom in on executive level audiences, the core demographic for most of our B2B clients, the picture shifts. Only 18% of senior biz executives prefer YouTube. 24% prefer Spotify, and 23% they prefer Apple Podcasts. And so let's think about the real life listening habits of an exec. They're listening while they're commuting. They're listening while they're traveling by plane. They're listening while working out. I never said watch. And with that, the definition of podcast, that definition is evolving. YouTube isn't just an audio platform. And so this is where we really do need to take note. It's time to think about what podcasting means for your brand. And we'll continue to get into that. But here's your 3 stats on podcasts, listeners, and platforms. Next up, we're going to dig into the 3 trends that stick out from 2024, and not shocking at all after the last few stats I mentioned around video consumption and YouTube. That's the first trend I want to dig into. That video podcasting is here to stay. We're going to break that down a little bit further. So if you're going to lean into the video trend, there are some things that I would suggest you do. Number 1, you want to decide up front. Are you creating a YouTube first show or an audio first podcast that you use as video as an enhancement? Video podcasts, they're built for searchability, shareability, and the visual elements, they matter a lot. Audio first podcasts, you're still going to use video as a marketing tool through short form clips, social media assets, and teaser content. Video helps brands grow. No one's disputing that. But it doesn't mean you have to have a video first show. It's about aligning with your goals and audience behavior. And it's worth calling out that your goals are also impacted by your resources, your bandwidth, your budget, all the things. And so when you are considering a video first show versus an audio first show, you do need to think about all that gets added to it when it comes to video first. Your set design, the visual animations, the look and feel of your guests, all of that takes precedent when you're designing your show. Trend number 2. Oh, it's the thing that's on everyone's mind everywhere. It's AI. And it almost goes without saying, but I had to. AI is everywhere. And it's in podcasting. Yes, it's making production much more scalable. Tools like Descript, Riverside, and Otter, they automate repetitive tasks, transcriptions, editing, show notes. It makes it easier to produce content. But here's the thing. AI, it's a tool. It's not a strategy. It can't replace creative storytelling or the thing that only humans can do, create human connection. And it won't replace editors. I don't care what you have to say. At least it won't today. Context and nuance, it requires human discernment. It requires human judgment. It requires the human art. Creating a great show is a mix of both science and art. And the human brings the art, they bring the judgment, they bring the experience that help us know what good looks like. One of the things that I found really interesting and just a very, very simple example of when AI is used wrong, and ethics play a big factor in this. If you're using AI for voice cloning or content creation, there has to be consent. The way we think about it at Share Your Genius is that we're human first, we're AI enabled, supported, because AI does help speed things up, like workflows, client delivery, et cetera, et cetera. But those final edits, the brand voice, the storytelling, it all comes from the human. The human brings the soul. The human brings the heart. AI without a human touch, it's just noise. Which leads us directly to trend number 3. It is now easier than ever to create and launch a podcast. The barrier to entry of creating a show and launching a show has always been low. It's even lower now. The tools are more accessible. You can record from literally anywhere. But starting a show, launching a show, it is not the same as sustaining a successful show. So what separates the great from the forgettable? Number 1, strategy. You have to have a clear North Star. Are you building to grow your brand? Are you using this to grow demand, to start conversation? Are you using this show to grow an audience? Are you bringing in a creator to help expand into a new niche? Those are the things that you really want to be thinking about. And storytelling. I think people can roll their eyes around the word storytelling because everyone gets confused about what storytelling really, really is. But at the end of the day, storytelling is very simply put, creating compelling content that helps your audience feel connected to you, creates relatability. It creates this moment that makes you say, I am like this person, or I want to be. That's the power of storytelling. How that gets used and managed and created, that's where the fun comes in. But creating that compelling content matters more than just the production quality alone. The other thing that comes to mind when we think about what separates the great from the forgettable is consistency. Without a clear plan and execution, your show will fizzle out. Oftentimes that translates to people thinking they have a show when they just had an episode. The other way to think about that is that you want to commit to a format and a show that you can sustain. And part of that comes with having a clear plan, a strategy, and the storytelling moments defined. Another thing I always like to call out here is that every show needs at least 3 key roles to give it the best shot at becoming truly successful. These are the 3 roles that you need to define to have a great show. Number 1 is the keeper of the story. They own the vision and the premise. The other is the producer. They take that vision and they take that premise and they execute against it on a per episode, per asset level basis. Then finally, the editor. They ensure the quality, whether it's for audio or for video or for both. So if you're doing it all yourself, my best advice is to find a partner, whether that's an agency, a freelancer, or somebody who can just be a thought partner in helping you see the forest above the trees. Because in the end, when we look back on 2024 and think on these 3 key stats and trends, it ultimately means the best podcasts aren't just content. They're fueled by strategy, a system, and they become ultimately a brand asset. The space isn't oversaturated. There is still massive opportunity. The audience and the appetite continues to grow. Platforms are evolving and brands need to adapt. The gap between listeners and creators is massive. So the real question isn't, should we start a podcast or is it too late? The real question is, how can I use it? That's where the magic begins. With all of that backdrop behind us, I want to dig into the mess. I want to dig into the magic. We're going to talk about the show strategy. That's the thing that can't be replaced, ignored, or frankly, even copied. And this is my favorite kind of discussion. You've got the basics and the landscape in mind. Now let's talk about how all this applies to you. One of the things I found most powerful when thinking about podcasting strategies specifically is recognizing a core tenet. Are you creating a show or are you leveraging a feed? I know that might seem like a small distinction or it might even be confusing, but answering that question, it changes everything. Your approach, how it aligns to your goals, your budget, and ultimately the impact your podcast has on your business. And I know you've heard me say this, and I'm going to say it a million more times. A podcast isn't just a podcast. It is never just a podcast because it is both a channel and content. And this is why I'm so bullish on podcasting. This is why I quit law school and built Share Your Genius. It's why I fell in love, because the power of podcasting as both a storytelling engine and a strategic marketing tool. The power and versatility is what instilled this love in me. So let's dig into this distinction. Are you launching a show or are you leveraging a feed? A show is a structured standalone series with a clear theme, defined format, and intentional listening experience. You could think of it like a TV series. Each episode follows a structure and the audience knows what to expect. They know who the characters are. A show is something people build into their routines. They come back for it. It becomes part of their world. A feed, on the other hand, it's a little bit more flexible. Think of it as more of a content engine or like a blog or a YouTube channel where you're continuously adding new content. A feed allows for what I would consider more of a mix of formats, interviews, solo shows, thought leadership, live event recordings, or even repurposed content with an audio first take. It's a distribution strategy rather than a self-contained series. It allows your audience to take your content on the road with them, wherever, however they want to listen. Both approaches are valuable, but they serve different purposes. So, when should you launch a show? If you're launching a show, you're making an intentional decision to build a media property. It's for brands that want a specific voice in the industry, competitive. You can have more narrative-driven story. You can have a more structured format that creates deep engagement, gets people hyped for what to expect, segment over segment. The other thing I want to call out here that's important for you to understand is when you will launch a show, there is different considerations that apply. Things like, should I put paid media behind this? What does my distribution strategy look like? How do I promote the show specifically? When does the season end? Or does it continue? When does it make sense to bring in different characters or even experiment with format? With a show, there are more intentional considerations. I'm going to give you some examples that are based on real life situations. Example a cybersecurity company launching a show called The Breach Report. It's a show breaking down the latest security breaches, which positions the brand as a leader in cybersecurity intelligence. Another B2B SaaS brand creating a show scaling up. It's a limited series where startup founders share their growth journeys. So if your goal is brand awareness, audience loyalty, meaning retention, and thought leadership where immersive and binge-worthy content experiences matter and make sense for your brand, a structured show, it's probably your best bet. On the flip side, when should you leverage a feed? A feed works best when your focus is on content distribution and really sales enablement. It's for brands that need flexibility in content formats, ongoing content strategy, and an easier way to repurpose existing assets. Here's a couple examples to help bring this to life. B2B company, they're running a webinar series and it's going very, very well. They want to turn those recordings into podcast episodes. That means we're going to optimize it for audio, cut it into clips for LinkedIn, and use it in email marketing campaigns. Another example of this could be how a show evolves into a feed. You started a podcast with a very specific format, a very specific branding, very specific positioning. And over time, the company's strategy's changed. This was a brand play. Now it needs to be a demand play. But you're still cranking out amazing content that you need to get out into the world. And you already have an audience that existed on the show channel that you launched. And so what you could do is think about how to leverage your other video assets, webinars, live events, or long form video, and transform it into audio first content for your podcast feed. The result there is that you're maximizing the ROI of your existing video production and then making your content accessible in a ton of other ways on other platforms. If your goal is demand generation, ABM and repurposing content across multiple channels, leveraging a podcast feed, it's a strategic play. And the best approach for your brand, whether it's a show or a feed, it depends on your goals, that North Star. If you want to build brand affinity, you want to tell a compelling story, and you want to create long-term engagement, go with a structured show. You can always add more shows to your media empire. If you need flexibility, demand gen, and integration into sales efforts, or repurposing your existing event series, for example, you want to leverage a feed. Again, you're going to have to brand all the things. You're going to have to be intentional with the design. You're going to have to understand distribution and how you leverage it. But it's a simple formula for how to think about whether you should have a show or a feed. Both are powerful. And no matter what you choose, your podcast shouldn't just exist, shouldn't be a siloed effort. It should work harder for your brand, and it can fuel your marketing strategy. And regardless of which path you take, I've got some powerful plays to maximize your podcast strategy so that you can walk away from this episode and deploy these plays. And now these plays work for both shows and feeds, so it's up to you based on what you need. The first play you can run is to maximize events by turning your events into recorded sessions, whether that's IRL, like in a live event, or it's an event series that you run digitally that you can repurpose and leverage for the podcast. If your company hosts those panels or roundtables, all of that can be repurposed onto your podcast feed. This isn't about just dumping raw event audio into a feed. Let me be very clear about that. It's about editing for the audio experience, making sure that it's engaging, making sure that there's intentional design behind it so that it's a valuable experience for your listeners, especially your listeners who weren't in the room to begin with. The second play to think about is how to use your proprietary research in your long-form content. Your podcast can actually be an engine for creating original research, turning data into thought leadership, whether you already have the data or you need to go get the data. So if you're running a research study, interview customers, gather insights, and turn those findings into a podcast series. A show could take the form of a limited series that deep dives into your findings. By the way, a limited series on your feed equals a show. A feed could use your research insights as episodic topics with an ongoing content stream. It's another way to think about it. Either way, your research becomes a strategic asset, positioning your company as that industry leader, that credible resource. And the third play to think about is to use your show for influencer or creator collaboration. This works for either a show or a feed. You want to expand your reach to a new audience? Partner with influencers, creators, or industry experts. It can be a game changer for you. You can feature incredible creators as guests. You could even have a brand show that a creator launches on your behalf. And none of it stops at just a podcast episode. You can maximize all of that content, all of that studio time by creating micro content for LinkedIn, repurposing it for your other channels and amplifying it across multiple platforms. It is never just a podcast. The right collaboration, it doesn't just create great content. It expands your brand's influence. Okay, we've covered a lot. We've talked about where podcasting started, how it's evolved, how it's evolving, and the trends shaping its future. But here's the most important question I want to leave you with. What does this all mean for you? When I think about podcasting, and honestly, the reason I fell in love with it to begin with is that, yes, it is never just a podcast. It's never, or shouldn't be, a piece of content sitting in isolation. It's a tool. It's a channel. It fuels a strategy. It's the foundation of a media-first approach to marketing. And when it's done with intention, it can drive serious results, my friends. But getting there means taking a step back and asking the right questions. So let me guide you through 3 final key takeaways to consider as you refine your podcast strategy for 2025. Number 1, know your why. Before you press record, get clear on why your podcast exists. And ask yourself that question honestly. Do we have a show or do we have a feed? What business outcome are we looking to achieve? Is it actually for demand gen and we're saying it's for brand? Is it really to grow an audience, or is it actually to build thought leadership with a consistent production schedule? Or is it an opportunity to open doors to people you might not had access to otherwise? When you don't know your why, your podcast becomes just another item on a to-do list that never ends. But when your why is clear, you can execute clearly. Everything aligns, from the stories you tell to the way you measure success. I'll give you an example. One of our clients in the SaaS space, they started their podcast for one reason: build relationships with target accounts. Not to sell them, but to actually build relationship, to learn from them, to hear from them, to understand them better, to validate that that's even who they should be talking to. And guess what? That's exactly what happened. While the podcast gave them a bridge to start conversations, the conversation is what kickstarted the relationship. And relationships are what fuel revenue. So yes, it eventually turned into sales opportunities. What is your podcast North Star? Is it a show? Is it a feed? How will you know if you're reaching it? You can't measure anything if you don't know why you're doing it. Number 2, build a system that scales. A successful podcast isn't just about that creativity. It's about consistency. That means having the right systems and partners in place to produce episodes efficiently, absolutely. Distribute content effectively, you betcha. And repurpose it. And I don't mean repurpose it like peanut butter spread, the same content across all your channels. That's just being lazy, y'all. It's about being consistent with the message that you want your brand saying and that you want people saying about your brand. Scaling a podcast doesn't mean doing more. It means doing it smarter. For example, every single episode you produce, it can fuel a strategy. That 30-minute episode, LinkedIn posts, email campaign, video snippets, blog articles. I think everyone knows this by now, right? But it has to tie to that larger content ecosystem, that larger content brand. And if you're just starting with your podcast as a central hub, that's awesome. Just use that central hub to distribute across your other channels with that clear point of view. So as you're thinking about 2025, ask yourself, do I have the right process and people in place to make this sustainable? Does everyone know the North Star message of our company, of our brand? Are we aligned on the content pillars? Are we aligned on who our creators are for the organization? And am I treating the show as part of our ecosystem, or am I treating it as a siloed effort? If it's siloed, you probably shouldn't do it. And then my last one is adapt the trends, but stay true to the medium. If 2024 taught us anything when it comes to podcasting, it's true that it's evolving faster and faster. Video is on the rise. There's no debate. AI tools are making production more scalable. And platforms like YouTube and Spotify and how the social media platforms are changing, they're shifting how we are consuming content. But don't just trace every trend because you can't. Ask yourself, what will serve my audience and what can we sustain? So yeah, maybe your podcast needs video, but maybe it doesn't. Maybe you can leverage AI to speed up workflows, but you still need human interaction and connection and creativity to tell a great story, to create a great piece of content. At the end of the day, trends come and go, players rise and fall. But the core of podcasting and why I fell in love with it, it's about creating connection. It's about serving someone who's laying in a hospital bed, wondering if their baby's going to survive and helping them feel hope. That's the power of podcasting. It's helping somebody on their commute get through it. It's giving somebody an opportunity to get up in the middle of their workday and go on a walk with their dog and feel like they're connected to friends and are learning something and are having fun. It's about giving people a break, a space, an opportunity to connect. So as you look ahead, remember experimentation is fun. Innovation, let's go. Evolution, it's mandatory. But don't lose sight of what makes this medium so powerful. It's your voice. It's your message. At the start of this episode, I called this my love letter to podcasting. And I meant it. I love podcasting. It's one of the most human forms of content we have. It's intimate, it's personal. It's a way to share ideas, tell stories, and have conversations that impact lives. And I love it because it works. It drives impact. And it's not just about downloads or vanity metrics. It's about building trust and doing it in a way that remains core to who we are. So here's my challenge for you. How is your podcast serving as the heartbeat of your brand? What stories will you tell? What connections will you create? And how will you make this medium work smarter for your business? No one is begging for more content, and yet we keep creating it. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that more doesn't always mean better, and even better doesn't mean people will actually consume what you create. Audiences aren't actively seeking your content. They are looking for connection. Podcasts aren't just episodes. They are storytelling tools that create a connection. It's a form of communication deeply ingrained in us. From the earliest cave paintings to fireside stories passed down through generations, humans have always used storytelling to make sense of the world, build trust, and create meaning. Stories activate parts of the brain that are tied to empathy and memory, and they create a unique bond between storyteller and the listener. So powerful, it has the power to change brainwaves. So yes, it's never just a podcast. It's an invitation to build those connections and create moments that resonate. It's not always about how many people listen. It's about how deeply they connect with those who do. Each episode is an opportunity to build trust, start meaningful conversation. And that's what drives business outcomes. As we wrap up the love letter, the question isn't, should you launch a podcast? The real question, how far can you take it? I'm Rachel. This is Wait For It, and I hope it was worth the wait.